She was sent as a joke to the ranch. But silent Cowboy put his coat on her shoulders and… Dust Creek, New Mexico Territory, autumn of 1887. The wind carried more than dust. It carried the memory of boot prints erased by time, of prayers left unanswered beneath a dry sky, and of voices that once cried out but were never heard. This was the kind of land where shame stuck harder than law, where the guilty walked free and the innocent were sold cheap. Ella May sat in the corner of a stagecoach, wrapped in silence and dust. Her dress was patched at the elbows, her bonnet stained with travel and sweat. On her lap lay a small, worn canvas bag, the only thing she owned besides her name. Tucked in the bag, folded like a prayer, was the letter. She had read it over 100 times, but she opened it again now as the stagecoach creaked along the last stretch of road. The handwriting was steady, patient, almost gentle. My name is Jed Carter. I live west of Dust Creek on a small ranch. My wife passed. I have a daughter, 3 years old. I am looking for a woman to raise her. You will be safe here. I offer no promises but peace. That word peace had undone her. 3 months ago, she had been a shadow behind bar doors, sold to a saloon after her mistress accused her of stealing a brooch Ella never touched. Her mother had just died. The house turned cold. The sheriff turned colder. The transaction was swift. No one asked her side. At the saloon, her name was taken. She became Girl, You, or worse. She learned how to disappear in plain sight. And when the thunderstorm hit one night, she ran barefoot into the mud, bleeding, scared, and absolutely alone. No one chased her. Until that letter found her, delivered by a stranger in a dusty cafe, who slid the envelope to her across a table, without a word. She had cried quietly into her coffee as she read it. And now, she was here. The stagecoach rattled to a halt beside a crooked fence and a leaning wooden gate. The driver climbed down and tossed her bag with a soft grunt. "Dust Creek," he said. "Ain't much past here but wind and fence posts." Ella stepped out. The air was dry and cool. Her boots crunched against gravel. In the distance stood a small house, old but sturdy, beside a red barn with a sagging roof. No one waited. She clutched the letter. Her breath came fast, shallow. She took a step forward, then another, until her feet found the worn path leading to the house. The barn door creaked. A man stepped out into the sun. He was tall, broad, dressed in a shirt rolled at the sleeves and worn work trousers. His jaw was sharp beneath a layer of stubble, his eyes unreadable under the brim of his hat. He moved, like someone used to silence, steady, guarded. He stopped a few yards from her. Ella forced her voice to rise. I came because of your letter. You said you needed someone. For your daughter." The man blinked, startled, his brow furrowed. Then, without a word, he raised both hands. Slowly he tapped his chest, shook his head, and made a slicing motion at his throat. Ella frowned. "I do not understand." He repeated the motions. Still, she could not piece them together. Her chest tightened. She held up the letter. "You sent this. You are Jed Carter. You wrote to me." The man hesitated, then nodded slowly. "But she began. At that moment, the front door of the house opened with a creak. A small voice called out, "Papa?" Ella turned. A little girl, no more than 3, stood barefoot in the doorway. Her blonde curls were tangled from sleep, her nightgown too long for her legs. She rubbed her eyes with one fist, then looked at Ella. Her mouth parted in a soft breath. Then she smiled. "Mama?" Ella froze. The man turned sharply toward the child, his body tensing. And then, laughter. Harsh, taunting, riding the wind from the ridge behind her. She turned. 5 young men on horseback sat at the top of the hill, watching the scene unfold like theater. One pointed at her and laughed. Another mimed a kiss, howling. "She showed up, told you she would. Look at her. Poor thing thinks this is a real weddin'." Ella's skin burned. She looked back at the house. No flowers, no welcome, no warmth. Jed Carter had not sent that letter. But someone had. and she had believed it. Her hands dropped to her sides. The letter slipped from her fingers and landed in the dust. Under the weight of the sun sinking behind the hills, Ella stood frozen, the laughter of the riders echoing like mockery across the dry land. Her cheeks stung, not from the dust, but from shame. A cruel joke, a trap disguised as kindness. She had come all this way, believing in something, only to be the punchline of someone else's evening entertainment. She bent slowly, picked up the letter, and folded it with shaking hands. Her lips parted to speak, but no sound came. Just breath, just defeat. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I should not have come." Jed stood still, expression unreadable, as she turned and walked away, her boots heavy on the gravel, her bag slung over one aching shoulder. The gate creaked open behind her. Her hand reached for it. "Please stay." Ella froze. It was not the man. It was the child. Annie stood there on the porch steps, clutching the banister with one hand and rubbing her eye with the other. Her voice was high and soft, still thick with sleep. "Please stay. Mama told stories. I want stories again." Ella turned around slowly, her breath caught. Jed stepped forward, pulling something from his shirt pocket, a small notepad and a pencil. He scribbled fast, the paper fluttering slightly in the breeze. Then he held it out. She took it. The words were plain, neat. "I did not write the letter, but if you have no place to return to, stay. Cook. Help with Annie, not as wife, as helper, safe." She looked up at him. He added something quickly and held the paper again. "No one will hurt you here." Ella's throat tightened. She stared at the man, this tall, strange, silent man whose eyes never quite stopped watching her. And then she looked at the little girl, who had taken a few timid steps toward her. Annie lifted her arms slightly, unsure, like she remembered how to ask for something but had forgotten whether it would be given. Ella's fingers clutched the strap of her bag. Her legs were trembling. She looked at the horizon, then at the dust on her boots, then back at Annie. "I can make cornbread," she said softly, "and stew." The girl smiled. Jed gave the smallest nod. Ella stepped back toward the gate. When she reached the fence, Jed moved forward. His hands worked at the buttons of his coat. Then, without a word, he slipped it from his shoulders and gently placed it over hers. It was warm. Worn. It smelled like wood smoke and horsehair. Ella blinked hard. He said nothing. She said nothing. But something passed between them, quiet, fragile, real. She bent and picked Annie up with practiced arms, the way a woman once taught her to carry laundry or a little brother too tired to walk. The child nestled in. Together the three of them crossed the yard, not as husband and wife, not yet as family, but no longer strangers. And inside, the hearth waited. The house creaked like an old memory, its boards worn and weary but standing still. Ella woke early each day, before the sun had stretched across the fields. There were eggs to collect, water to boil, and ashes to sweep from the hearth. Annie often padded in sleepily, hair tangled, clutching a rag doll Ella had stitched from scraps. The child clung to her quickly. She followed Ella from room to room, helped knead biscuit dough with flour-covered fingers, and nestled into her lap every night to hear stories Ella barely remembered, but tried to piece together from her mother's old voice. At first, the house felt like something borrowed. Ella tread lightly, hands always busy, eyes cautious. But days passed. The ache in her chest softened, just a little, with each meal served and every time Annie smiled. Jed remained mostly silent. He would rise with the sun, leave without sound, and return with saddle dust on his sleeves and sun in his beard. But he noticed things. When she struggled to lift the wooden bucket, he reached silently to take one and carry it beside her. When she patched the window with fabric, he returned that evening with tools and mended the frame. And when the rain came one afternoon, hard and sudden, Ella ran outside to gather the laundry from the line. She slipped in the mud, laughing despite herself. And when she turned, Jed was already hammering a plank into place, crafting a small shelter from the storm. He never looked directly at her, but his presence was constant, like the mountains in the distance. Ella began to leave him notes. Simple ones. "Soup is in the pot." Annie asked about the horses again. "I fixed the curtain in the back room." She never expected a reply, but sometimes the next morning she would find a single line scratched below her handwriting. "Thank you. She likes the gray one best. It looks better now." One night, the wind howled louder than usual, and the roof trembled as if the house itself feared the dark. Annie could not sleep. Ella held her close on the cot, whispering the story of a girl who followed a wolf into the woods and returned with courage in her bones. Annie finally drifted off. Ella stayed awake longer, watching the fire flicker, her body aching in places she had forgotten existed. She stood to add wood to the stove, but her vision blurred. Her legs gave out. She collapsed. When she opened her eyes, the room had changed. She was lying on the guest bed. A blanket was tucked under her chin. A small basin of water sat on the nightstand, next to a folded cloth. She turned her head. Jed sat in the doorway, elbows on his knees, watching the fire. She tried to speak, but he raised a hand gently. It was not a command, it was care. He stood and crossed the room, not hurried, not afraid. He touched her forehead once, then pointed to the water. She nodded weakly. He left. The next morning, the kitchen smelled like eggs and cornmeal. A fire was already burning. Jed had cooked. Ella sat slowly at the table, muscles sore. Annie climbed into her lap, holding out a small flower she'd picked from the edge of the fence. "Mama's tired," the girl said. Ella smiled, pressing her cheek to Annie's hair. That night, before the lamps were turned down, she found a note beside her pillow in Jed's neat, square writing. "You should rest tomorrow. I will handle the animals. Annie needs you stronger than the chores do." She stared at the words for a long time. No one had ever told her to rest. No one had thought she mattered more than the work. For the first time in her memory, Ella felt what it meant to be cared for, not wanted, not used. Just seen. She lay back on the pillow, eyes wet, heart thudding slow. And somewhere beyond the window, the night turned quiet, as if the wind itself had stepped outside to let her sleep. The attic smelled of dust and cedar, the kind that clung to forgotten things. Ella had gone up searching for a thicker quilt. Autumn had crept in early, nipping at the eaves, and Annie had started to cough lightly at night. She moved slowly, careful not to stir the quiet too much. The boards creaked beneath her steps as golden light poured through the small window. In the corner, half covered by an old rug, sat a wooden chest. The lid was cracked at the hinge. Curiosity guided her hand. Inside were baby clothes, stitched with loving care. A pair of tiny moccasins, faded now but beautifully crafted. A comb with a turquoise bead inlaid on the handle, and then a folded parchment. She opened it. A sketch done in charcoal and love. A man. A woman. A child. The man was Jed, younger but unmistakable. The child was Annie, still small, clutching a wooden horse. The woman, however, was not Ella. She was Comanche. Long hair in 2 braids, a necklace of carved bone. Her eyes were kind, strong, alive. Ella stared at it for a long time, her chest tightening, her throat dried. She traced the image with the tips of her fingers. There had been someone before. Of course there had. But this was love. This was family. And she, what was she? She folded the drawing carefully, placed it back, and closed the lid. Her hands trembled. That evening, she sat on the porch long after Annie had gone to sleep. The stars above blinked without answer. The wind stirred the grass. The door creaked softly behind her. Jed stood in the threshold, watching. She held up her hand. "Please, not now." He hesitated, then stepped back inside. The next day, while at the well, she met the neighbor, an old man named Tom who passed through occasionally to trade eggs or share news from town. He leaned on the fence, squinting. "She found the drawing, huh?" he asked. Ella didn't answer. Tom sighed. She was too good for this place. Jed's wife, Comanche woman. Town hated her, called her names, said she cursed the land. Ella turned toward him, her voice low. What happened? Tom rubbed his jaw, eyes hardening. They hung her, behind the church, said she was a stain. Jed tried to stop them. They beat him near to death, broke his voice. Ain't spoken since. That was 5 years ago. Ella stood still, her arms prickled, her breath came short. They killed her, for loving him? She asked. Tom nodded. That, and being who she was. Ella felt the ache grow in her throat. She returned to the house, wordless. All day, she moved like a ghost, feeding chickens, boiling water, fixing Annie's braid, all without sound. Jed watched her, but she never looked his way. That night, she packed her small bag. Jed found her near the fence, bag in hand, coat too thin against the wind. She didn't wait for him to write. I am not her, she said softly. And I never will be. Jed took out the notebook anyway, scribbled quickly. I know. She swallowed hard. Then why? Why let me stay? Because Annie smiles when you're here, because you sing to her at night, because this house feels like something again. Ella's hand shook. But I feel like a shadow, like I was never chosen, just tolerated. Jed stepped forward, his pencil scratched again. I did not choose you in a letter, but I have chosen you every day since. She looked away, eyes glossy. I do not know if that is enough. He nodded, not pressing further. She turned back toward the house. For now, she would stay. But something inside her had cracked. Not from betrayal, but from the weight of not knowing if she truly belonged. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and silver against the gray morning sky. Ella stood at the stove stirring a pot of oats while Annie stacked blocks on the floor, her small hands steady, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth, in quiet focus. The morning had been peaceful, until it wasn't. It began with hooves, loud, careless. Laughter followed, rough and mocking, growing louder as it neared the ranch gate. Ella stiffened. She knew that sound, that tone. She stepped onto the porch just as 3 horses skidded to a halt by the fence. The riders were young, their coats fine, and their mouths fouler than the whiskey on their breath. Well, look who's still here, one of them sneered. Little Miss Saloon Special. Guess she really liked the joke. The second leaned forward, grinning. Wonder if she's figured it out yet. That she was the free prize in a letter-writing game. She must like broken things, the third added, nodding toward the house. That man can't even speak, and he's got her and a brat under his roof. Must be real desperate. Ella's breath came sharp, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Inside, Annie whimpered. Jed stepped onto the porch behind Ella, eyes like stone, arms folded. He said nothing. He never did. But his stance shifted, shoulders squared, jaw locked. He was ready. One of the boys laughed. Look at him. Ain't even got the guts to tell us off. What a man. Another leaned over the saddle horn, smirking. Hey, darlin', you want a real husband? I got 10 fingers and a working mouth. Ella stepped forward. Her voice rang out loud and clear. One more word, and I'll make you chew dirt. They laughed again, until she stepped off the porch, shotgun in hand. The same one she had oiled just 2 nights ago. She cocked it. The sound silenced the wind. The riders froze. Ella's voice did not shake. One more step and I shoot. I'll protect this child. And this man. The man who had never spoken, but always stood beside her. The child who called her Mama in her sleep, even when she hadn't earned the right. She planted her feet. This isn't a joke. This isn't yours to mock. You think you can ride out here and break what you didn't build? Her voice cracked with fury. You don't get to come here and laugh at us. One of the riders shifted nervously. The one with the slicked back hair tried to smile. Come on now, no need for drama. Get off my land, she said. Still, they hesitated, looking at one another, hoping Jed would back down, hoping this was bluff. But Jed stepped forward too, not armed, not loud, just present. And that was enough. The oldest boy's grin faltered. "She ain't worth it anyway," he muttered. "Neither are you," Ella replied. They turned their horses. One spat into the dirt. Another looked back once, at the silent man, the fierce woman, and the little house behind them that refused to be shaken. Then they rode. When the dust settled, Ella lowered the shotgun slowly. Her arm shook, but her spine stayed straight. Jed looked at her, eyes shining with something he did not have words for. Annie peeked from the window, then came running. Ella dropped to her knees just in time to catch her. "I was scared," the girl said. "Me too," Ella whispered, wrapping her close. "But it's okay now. They're gone." She looked up to find Jed still watching her. And for the first time she realized this was not his home anymore. It was theirs. And she had just defended it like someone who knew that truth. Blood soaked through his sleeve before Ella even realized what had happened. One of the boys had thrown a glass bottle, not out of aim, but out of spite, and Jed had stepped forward, just in time to take it across the shoulder. The bottle shattered against him with a sickening crack. Glass rained to the ground, his body jerked from the impact. He did not cry out. He simply staggered once, caught himself on the porch post, and exhaled through his nose. His jaw clenched. A low hiss escaped between his teeth, but still he did not speak. Ella dropped the shotgun instantly. Her breath hitched, her heart crashing against her ribs. "Jed!" It was the first time she had ever said his name out loud. Soft, breathless, laced with fear and something deeper. He looked at her, his face pale now, sweat already forming at his brow. "Sit," she said, her voice no longer trembling. Sharp, commanding. "You are bleeding." She helped him into the house, his steps heavy and uneven. He said nothing, just let her guide him. Annie stood frozen in the doorway, clutching her doll to her chest. Ella all but shoved Jed into the kitchen chair, then spun toward the cabinet, flinging open drawers and doors until she found a clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey, and a roll of old bandage. She knelt before him and began cutting away the blood-soaked fabric. "Why would you do that?" she whispered, blinking back tears as she worked. "Why would you step in front of me like that? You could have let me take the hit." Jed didn't answer. He only shook his head once, slowly, and closed his eyes. "You could have been killed," she murmured, her voice cracked, thin and aching. "You could have died, and I cannot." Her hands stilled for a moment. The cut across his shoulder was jagged, not too deep, but raw and angry. Blood had already soaked through the shirt. She poured whiskey onto the cloth and cleaned it gently, biting her lip as he flinched. "You fool," she whispered, tears now slipping freely down her cheeks. "You damned quiet fool." Jed reached for the small notepad he kept tucked behind the jar of utensils. With his good hand, he wrote quickly, the pencil shaking. He held it up. "You do not have to stay out of pity." Ella stared at the words. Her bottom lip trembled. She swallowed hard, and as she tied the bandage tight around his arm, she shook her head slowly. "I am not staying out of pity." Her voice was soft but steady, like a fire holding against the wind. "I am staying because this place, this house, you, Annie." She looked up at him, eyes shining, voice tightening. "It feels like home." Jed stared at her, his breath caught, his fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. Ella reached up and brushed the damp hair from his forehead. Her palm lingered, then slid to his cheek. "You don't need to speak," she whispered. "I hear you just fine." But he shook his head, gently, and then he opened his mouth. His lips moved slowly, as if each syllable weighed more than bone. His throat worked to push out something it had not dared to shape in years. "Stay." It was little more than air, cracked and broken, but it was a voice. His voice. "Please." Ella gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Behind her, Annie let out a tiny cry and ran forward, wrapping her arms around Jed's leg. Tears burst from Ella's eyes. She dropped to her knees beside him, forehead pressed to his. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Jed, I am staying." Jed trembled, not from pain, but from something deeper. Relief. Release. The silence had broken, and all it had taken was one word, one wound, one woman who chose to stay. The days that followed were quieter, not because nothing was said, but because now everything meant more. Ella began waking before sunrise, not out of fear, not from habit, but with purpose. She had stitched her name into the rhythm of the ranch, and now she began to shape it into something softer. She bought fabric from the traveling peddler, pale blue for curtains, a warmer brown for winter clothes. She patched every threadbare towel, every hole in Annie's socks. She painted the kitchen shelf and placed a single flower in a glass jar at the center of the table. But her biggest work was for Annie. In the small nook near the hearth, she began building a bookcase, just a simple thing Jed helped her nail together from leftover pine boards. Ella lined it with the stories her mother used to tell, handwritten, rewritten, one tale at a time. Tales of foxes with clever hearts, of mountains that remembered names, of women who were brave even when no one saw them. Annie would sit on the floor each night, legs crossed, wide-eyed, and Ella would read from pages she had written by candlelight. One afternoon, Jed stepped inside with charcoal stains on his fingers. Annie skipped behind him, grinning from ear to ear, holding up a wrinkled page. "Papa drawed this," she said. It was a drawing of her and Ella, holding hands, standing under a crooked tree that shaded the house. Ella met Jed's eyes. He looked away, sheepish. "You're teaching her," Ella said softly. Jed gave a small nod, then pointed at the notepad. He wrote slowly, more neatly now than before. "If she can speak with pictures, she will never be trapped like I was." Ella swallowed hard. Her hand brushed his as she took the paper from him. "You're giving her a voice," she whispered. He looked at her, then wrote one more word. "We." The word struck deeper than anything he had said aloud. Late in September, a knock came at the door. It was Reverend Ellis, the circuit minister, with his usual weathered Bible and warm but probing eyes. "Just making my rounds," he said, sipping the coffee Ella had poured. "Wanted to check on this new arrangement. I see a family here." Ella stiffened slightly. Jed sat beside her, his hand resting just behind hers on the table. "I do not ask to pry," the Reverend added, eyes twinkling. "But folks wonder when the Lord might bless this house proper." Ella glanced at Jed. Jed met her eyes. He did not write. He did not speak. But he reached across and placed his hand gently over hers. No pressure, no demand. Just choice. She smiled. "No ceremony needed, Reverend," Ella said, voice firm but kind. "We've already chosen each other." The Reverend nodded once, satisfied. As he left, Annie waved from the porch. Jed stood with one arm around Ella's shoulders. They watched the rider fade into the horizon. Inside the house, sunlight fell across the bookshelf, the drawing on the wall, the coat still hanging near the door. Everything had changed. Not because someone had rescued her, but because they had all stayed and built something worth staying for. The wind danced across the porch, carrying snowflakes like whispers. They landed on the railing, on the steps, on Jed Carter's shoulders, though he made no move to brush them off. He stood still beneath the low winter sky, arms folded, watching the two figures below. Ella's laughter rang out, bright and soft, as she crouched behind a snowbank, waiting to surprise Annie. The little girl squealed, flinging a scoop of snow in her direction before running again, curls bouncing beneath a too-big bonnet. It was their first winter together, their first real season as a family. And the house no longer looked like a shelter from the world, it looked like a home. Curtains fluttered in the kitchen window. Firewood was stacked neat beside the door. A horseshoe hung above the threshold, polished and tied with a red ribbon Annie had insisted made it luckier. Inside, warmth waited. Ella stepped in later that afternoon to change out of her wet shawl. Jed remained outside with Annie, drawing shapes in the snow with a stick and pointing out birds overhead. Ella hung her scarf by the hearth, her fingers stiff from cold, but her heart steady. She opened the small cedar chest in the corner, looking for a dry blanket. Instead, she found the coat. The old one. The one he had placed around her shoulders on that first day, when her hands were shaking and the letter still smelled like hope. It was folded neatly. Clean. Repaired. On top of it, a small piece of parchment. Her breath caught as she picked it up. The handwriting was uneven, but unmistakably his. That day, I did not call your name, but my heart had already chosen you. She sat slowly on the edge of the bed, the coat in her lap, the note pressed to her chest. No one had ever chosen her before. Not without shame, not without a price. Outside, Annie shouted, and Jed responded with a whistle, sharp and clear. His voice was still quiet most days, but that sound came easier now. Annie had taught him how to use it again, just like he had taught her to draw, to see the world in lines and shapes and stories. Ella folded the note and tucked it inside the pocket of the coat. She stepped back onto the porch. Jed turned as she approached, snow clinging to his boots, his hands stuffed in his pockets. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw everything he never had to say. She stood beside him in silence, not needing words. Below, Annie threw snow into the air, giggling as it rained back down. Ella leaned into Jed's side, her head resting lightly against his arm. "Looks like we're keeping this one," she murmured. He nodded. Then reached out, fingers slow, deliberate, and took her hand. The sky above them shifted with pale light. Inside the house, the fire crackled. Outside, the snow kept falling. And for the first time in both their lives, the season passed not in silence, but in peace. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you that even the most broken souls can find home, even in a world built on dust and silence, then let it live on with you a little longer. Tap the like button if Ella, Jed, and little Annie found a place in your soul. And if you want more love stories carved from gunpowder skies, stolen glances, and hearts too brave to quit, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. New tales ride in every week. Some end in heartbreak, some in healing, all in truth. T.O. Until next time, ride safe and love louder.